Even to those raised in a culture where it's the norm, the practice of tipping can often seem downright random. Why do we tip some service providers for their efforts, but not others? Why are some jobs allowed to pay so little as long as there's the expectation that tips will cover the rest? And who exactly made all these unspoken rules? Today, we're pulling out our smartphone calculators to figure out why tipping is a thing. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History Food channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other mealtime customs you would like to hear about next. Okay, now it's time for the tip-off. Historically speaking, the practice of tipping was originally brought to you by the English. As for when exactly that happened, well, not everyone quite agrees. What we know is that during the medieval era, it wasn't unheard of for serfs to receive gifts of money from their masters as a reward for extraordinary service. And by the Tudor period, which covers the late 15th to early 17th centuries, the practice had carried into other areas of English life. Guests in private homes would frequently reward the host servants with tips called bail, and leaving gratuities for workers at places of commerce like bars and coffee houses also became commonplace. In other words, the upper crust had so much money they literally gave it away like a gold star in kindergarten to people struggling to make ends meet. The practice was then imported to America in the late 19th century by British aristocracy and people trying to mimic British aristocracy. However, the working class in America found the practice to be insulting, classist, and condescending, and the average Joe resented the growing expectation that you would first pay for your meal and then also pay the server. From that backlash grew a whole anti-tipping movement. That movement was so widely supported, it even spread to Europe and pretty much wiped out the practice. Ironically, however, the movement was stamped out in the US after the abolition of slavery, which directly led to the creation of menial service jobs that paid no wages due to the expectation that the worker would receive tips. Today, tipping is still very much expected in America, while Europeans, for the most part, don't really have to worry about it. Not everyone was happy about tipping's American comeback. In fact, 6 separate states even tried to ban the practice in 1915. Georgia, for example, deemed tips to be illegal commercial bribes, and Iowa threatened to fine or imprison any worker who accepted a tip, although revealingly the person who offered the tip would be in the clear. Nonetheless, the custom continued to grow in popularity, especially in the South, and all the anti-tipping laws were struck down by the courts within a decade or so. By that point, restaurant owners had long since realized how much their businesses benefited from leaning on tips to pay less than minimum wage, and tipping began to become standard practice throughout the US. The passage of Prohibition in 1919 also had a big effect by depriving restaurants and bars of the income they made selling booze. To make up the shortfall, they began to pay their employees even less and encouraged patrons to tip instead. New Deal-related legislation passed in 1938 made it federal law that employers only had to pay tipped workers an amount that met the minimum wage when added up with their projected tips. The government has tinkered with the system a few times since, but today, only 7 states require that tipped workers receive the full federal minimum wage. Meanwhile, it's unclear why some professions, like waiting tables, are expected to be tipped, while others that do similar work, like serving fast food, are not. Or the fact that the amount of the tip is a percentage of the bill as opposed to the actual work performed. In other words, a waiter who brings you filet mignon gets more than the one who brings you pancakes, even though they both perform the exact same task. So it's not a perfect system, but at least the potential for a good tip will motivate your server to a better job, right? Well, as it happens, no, it won't. In fact, studies have shown there's no correlation at all between job performance and tip amount. On top of that, countless businesses regularly steal their employees' tips. For example, in 2020, DoorDash paid a $2.5 million settlement in connection with a lawsuit that claimed the company was pocketing tips while telling customers they went to their delivery personnel. Then there's the practice of mandatory tipping, when gratuities are included as part of your bill, which in addition to feeling a little like blackmail, has led to a few genuine scandals, because those types of charges are very easy to hide among legitimate costs on an invoice. The practice of tipping is regarded in different ways around the world. In China, for example, people traditionally do not tip anyone for anything. That being said, since the 1980s, the practice has become increasingly common in some areas of the country. And if you're just visiting and you stay at a hotel that mostly serves foreign guests, you should have some cash ready for your attendance. Same if you take a guided tour. Tipping isn't traditional in Japan either. In fact, the culture has many social rules about how you are supposed to give gifts of money. And if you don't follow them, you might find yourself accidentally insulting someone. Nonetheless, it's been increasingly included in hotel and restaurant bills over the last few decades. It's not traditional in India either, though it has become increasingly common in recent times thanks to food delivery services. Meanwhile, Canadians aren't quite as big on tipping as their neighbors to the south, but it's still fairly standard practice in the Great White North. And in Mexico, you'll likely only be expected to tip at higher-end places, and not for your mozzarella sticks at Applebee's. Russians call tips "chayavye," which means for the tea, but tipping culture there is as convoluted as it is in the States. Tipping was pretty common before the Russian Revolution, then became taboo under communism, and has made something of a comeback since the fall of the Soviet Union. At some point or another, we all probably stop for a moment to wonder why a tip is called tip. One popular explanation would have you believe that the word is an acronym for to ensure promptness, or alternatively, to ensure performance, or maybe even that TIPS stands for to ensure prompt service, but none of these are correct. Acronyms, for the most part, are a phenomenon of the 20th century, and both tip and tips have been in use way longer than that. The truth is, tip, as we use it today, was derived from 17th century thieves' camp, in which it meant to give, hand off, or pass, likely as in stolen goods. In criminal circles, this eventually evolved into a secondary use that indicated a gratuitous gift, usually of something illegal. The word in that sense was first recorded in the 1706 George Farquhar play, The Beaux Stratagem, and it's pretty easy to see how the modern use of the term grew from there. The word gratuity, meanwhile, is probably even older. No one is quite sure whether it derives from the 14th century word gratuite, meaning graciousness, or the far older Latin word gratuitus, meaning free or freely given. But whatever the case, gratuity, in the sense we use it today, has been in use since at least 1530. Tipping may still be a common practice in America, but that doesn't mean anyone is happy about it. A 2024 report found an emerging backlash against the custom had caused frequency of tips to decline in pretty much every category, including for waitstaffs, taxi and rideshare drivers, delivery personnel, and even hairdressers. That backlash is most pronounced among Gen Zers and millennials, but those groups are also far from alone. Even older generations seem to be increasingly wary of ever-frequent requests for tips, as well as a rise in normal tipping rates. Nonetheless, along with women, 71% of whom say they always tip, compared to just 63% of men, older people remain among the most reliable tippers. According to the same report, 86% of baby boomers say they always tip at a restaurant, compared to 78% of Gen Xers, 56% of millennials, and 35% of Gen Zers. The size of a tip increases with age group as well. For example, just 17% of Gen Zers say they leave a 20% tip, compared to 28% of millennials, 41% of Gen Xers, and 52% of baby boomers. Of course, a lot of those differences can be chalked up to the fact that those older generations tend to have a lot more money than the younger ones. But it's not all just about income. Despite having more cash, older generations are actually considerably more likely to think that tipping culture has gotten out of hand. 35% of Americans, for example, say they're annoyed by those pre-entered tip screens that have become ubiquitous at places like restaurants and food trucks, and will tip less when they encounter one. But that number swells to 48% among baby boomers, compared to 40% of Gen Xers, 23% of millennials, and just 17% of Gen Zers. Of course, just because something is annoying doesn't mean it doesn't work. The Starbucks Corporation, for example, claims that about 50% of its customers leave a tip when they encounter one of those tip screens, which is way more than the number of people who ever threw money into a tip jar. In other words, despite growing frustration, technology has made soliciting tips easier and more effective than ever. Combined with the ever-increasing cost of living and an uncertain economy, the practice isn't going away anytime soon, unless everyone starts leaving mixtapes instead of cash. So what do you think? Has tipping culture gone too far? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other weird history food videos.